Hi and welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover just the very basics of what a Visual Basic procedure is and look at a simple example of creating and using our own. First, let's get started just with a little bit of terminology. In the last week, we talked about what were called methods. They were blocks of code that performed some tasks. The term method applies to the term procedures in Visual Basic. So instead of using the word methods, we're going to start using the word procedure to refer to a Visual Basic block of programming code. Unfortunately, in the text, there is an error in terms of terminology. In the book, the terms procedure and function, something we'll see shortly, are used as two different entities, whereas, as we will see, procedures in Visual Basic exist, and there's two varieties of procedures, sub-procedures and function procedures, but they are both types of procedures. As we move along in our discussion, we're going to see that variables can be created in submain, as we've seen in previous examples of Visual Basic. But we're going to see that local variables in general are variables declared within the procedure in which they are used. So we'll see variables declared in submain as we have in the past. We know that once we declare a variable, from that point forward in submain, we're able to use it. Our own procedures that we're going to create today can have their own set of variables. It's important to realize that local variables have scope, which refers to visibility, only of the procedure in which they are declared. So in other words, if you declare a variable within a procedure, that procedure knows about it, but the other procedures are not able to access the memory associated with that variable. So most programs consist of a main procedure as well as multiple other procedures in order to get the work done in a program. So again, a procedure is a block of Visual Basic code that performs a task. Once you create a procedure, the power of it is that you can then call. This is also called invoking a procedure. And that's really the power of the procedure, because once you create it, you can call it multiple times. It makes it easier for you and other programmers to read and maintain your code as well, because if you're able to break up, say, a program of 1,000 lines into pieces of which you can attach names to that apply meaning for accomplishing different tasks, it makes it easier for you and other programmers to read that code and maintain it. So let's look at a simple example. I'm switching gears here, going over to Visual Studio. And at this point, we have just a basic shell of a program. I have done a few things. I added a comment at the top to explain just that this is a simple demonstration. It's often a good tactic to add a comment to the top of your programs to explain what you're doing. I turned option strict on, option explicit on, also good habits. And then in submain, all I've done so far is to output a message. This is my example of using a sub procedure. So I haven't actually created or called my own sub procedure yet, which is my next step. So I want to point out that submain is itself a procedure. In fact, it's the starting point of every executable program. So when you hit start without debugging, this program is going to look for a procedure called submain and execute that procedure. So if I wanted to, for example, output a message that said hello in my program, and I wanted it to appear after the message, this is my example of using a sub procedure, I could very easily add it to submain here. But since I want to demonstrate how you can create your own sub procedure, let me go ahead and write it first, and then we'll talk about the specific syntax that we're seeing here. Okay, So first of all, it's very important to realize that if you're defining a new procedure, it can't be inside of submain. It should be after the end sub of submain. This block of code could either go after end sub or before the definition up here of submain. The order does not matter. But now that I have this procedure, I could say I am going to move that line of code to output hello and put it in my new procedure. So how did I create this thing? I started with the keyword sub. Notice corresponding end sub down here closes off the definition of this procedure. And then I gave the procedure a name. So the name can't have any spaces in it, and it should usually be some sort of verb describing what it does. So output hello is an action. It describes what this procedure does. We'll see later what the implications of empty parentheses are, but for right now, this means that we're not passing any input to this procedure. It doesn't need any additional input to do its work. And then the body of this procedure are just all the lines of code in between. And this one is extremely simple. It just outputs the word hello. So if I go ahead and I try to run this program, I am going to see my output that says this is my example of using a sub procedure, but I don't see my output of hello. So this is an important lesson because you can create as many sub procedures as you want, but if you never call them from submain or something that submain calls, the procedures will never be executed. So what I want to do is come up to submain and actually call output hello. And notice it's now appearing in my IntelliSense. I can either type it or select from the list with empty parentheses because I'm not passing anything to this procedure. So to call a procedure in Visual Basic, as well as most other programming languages, you just name the procedure that you're trying to call. It has to match up to the name as it's defined. So now if I execute this, I see this is my example of using a sub procedure, but now I see the word hello. When the program began, it found submain, the starting point of every program, displayed the message, this is my example. When it got to the invocation, in other words, call of output hello, it jumped down to this block of code and executed all statements within. In this case, we only had one statement that output hello. When it reaches the end of that procedure, it jumps back up and returns to main. Now, if I wanted to, I could call this procedure as many times as I wanted to. I could call it in a row, or I could do some other work and then call it again. Let's see what happens. So here we see hello being executed 4 times, of course, because I actually called it 4 times. Now, in this particular example, it's kind of silly because, my procedure is not really doing too much. Our examples will get more complicated and more relevant as we move along. But if I wanted to output the word hello 4 times and I wanted to utilize the same procedure, a better approach would be to create a variable count and either start it at 0 or 1. Let's say I started at 1 and I say do while count is less than or equal to 4. Let's say we want to output hello 4 times. Now I used to do while. This could have also been a for loop instead. But because I used to do while, I do need to be cognizant of the fact that I need to manually increment count. So this is applying some of the techniques of the earlier chapter on loops. This is a counter-controlled loop that starts as 1. As long as it's less than or equal to 4, it will call output hello. So each time it calls it, keep in mind it jumps down to this block of code, executes, returns back, and then increments the count by 1. So although count was 1 the first time through, here it's incremented to 2. Loops back around, 2 is less than 4, and this pattern continues until count is eventually incremented to 5 it loops back up and is no longer less than or equal to 4, thus ending the loop. So let's give this a try. So there we see the same output as we had when we manually called our procedure 4 times. One thing that I wanted to mention is that you may be wondering why I put the loop in main. Could I not have written a called output hello just once and had the loop inside of output hello? That would have been another way to do it. It would have worked just as well in this scenario. I would, however, keep to the current implementation because if you put the loop inside of a procedure called output hello, you really probably need to call it output hello 4 times. And then what happens if later in your program, let's say I wanted to do some things and then I wanted to set count back at 1 and this time loop through 5 times. Let me add an empty space in here so you can see. I'm going to do it a few times here so we can see a vertical break between the two outputs. Here I've created a loop that's going to output hello 5 times. Let's try it. We should see 4 and then we should see 5 times. So there we see our 4, there we see our 5. So the advantage of keeping the loop here is that it doesn't tie this procedure up to specific execution iterations. It keeps it generic and general so that we can call it and use it as we want to. So just so you know, let's kind of go back to the basics here. I'm going to go back to output hello just one time. And we'll get rid of our count. I wanted to show you that inside of this procedure, you can have variables. So let's just say that I had a string variable called message and I set it equal to hello. I can then refer to message and output that value. Or this could have been a constant, really. I could probably make this a constant because the chance of that changing, oops, let's use capitals, is unlikely because we're going to keep with the text of hello. And let me go ahead and execute this. Okay, so we get the expected hello. The difference is I created a constant to hold the text and then I referred to that constant. So procedures can have their own set of local variables. Just be aware that main cannot access message. If I would try to do so, I would get an error message. And it says that it's not declared, and you'd say, well, of course it is, it's down here. But remember that these constants, these variables, are only accessible within the procedure in which they're declared. So that wouldn't work. If we wanted to share data between main and output hello, we would need to work on this a bit. In future videos, we will look at how we can pass data either to a procedure or back from a procedure.